A president just stripped a medal off another president. Karol Nawrocki revoked Ukraine's highest honor from Volodymyr Zelensky, and half a country cheered while the other half froze in confusion. Some Poles thought, good, finally. Others thought, are we insane? Picking a fight with our own ally mid-war? Both sides have a point. Stay with me, because the truth is darker than either. At the center of this fight is not territory or weapons. It is memory. It is history that never got cleaned up, and one word makes Poles go cold: Volhynia. Between 1943 and 1944, around 100,000 Poles were slaughtered in an ethnic cleansing. The crime was simply being Polish. That was enough reason to die, and this is not a dusty textbook story. People alive today remember it. Grandparents who had minutes to flee their homes, relatives murdered, names passed down through families who survived by running. But here is where it gets complicated. This was never a clean Pole versus Ukrainian story. Ukrainian neighbors hid Polish families and saved their lives, and Ukrainians were murdered too. The killers came from the UPA, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. For decades, even Ukrainian schools called them Nazi collaborators and colonial police. So how did they become national heroes? Here is the uncomfortable answer. A nation at war needs armed heroes, and Ukraine needed symbols that were not tied to brotherhood with Russia. For centuries, Ukraine had no state of its own. When it finally needed a story about fighting for independence, the UPA was one of the only forces that ever marched under a Ukrainian banner. Strangely, the heroic myth was not even born in Ukraine. It was built by the Ukrainian diaspora in the United States and Canada after 1945, then exported back home once the Soviet Union collapsed. There is a catch. Even Kyiv cannot escape. These leaders cannot officially be citizens' hero figures because they died before Ukraine existed on any map. They fought for a country they never lived to see. Attempts to rehabilitate figures like Bandera and Shukevich grew louder after 2014, when real war with Russia exploded in Donbass. Suddenly, a story of resistance mattered more than smoothing things over with Poland. Now picture 2022. This was the moment everything could have changed. Poland threw open its doors and took in over 1 million Ukrainian refugees in just weeks. Mutual goodwill between the two nations hit the highest level in history. Almost nobody wanted to argue about statues and street names. The window to fix history was wide open. Poland slept through it. And here is a fact that surprises people. While far-right parties surged across France, Germany, and Italy, in Ukraine support for the far-right collapsed from around 10% in 2012 to barely 2%. But the longer the war dragged on, the harder that window slammed shut. Cold relations, media battles, and units like the Azov Regiment made compromise politically toxic. Today, the first searches and exhumations of Polish UPA victims in years are finally happening. And in Ukrainian media, Zelensky is the one offering to talk. Cynics smell elections, not reconciliation. Because honestly, Ukraine has bigger problems right now, much bigger. Over 4 years of full-scale invasion turned the country into something our usual categories cannot even describe. It is not a country at peace. It is not a classic total war either. The news shrinks Ukraine down to a front line and a counter of donated weapons. That tells you nothing about daily life. Since February 24th, 2022, Ukraine has lived under martial law. That means no normal elections, no regular change of power. The military and security services hold far more control. Martial law is necessary for a state under fire, but it creates a brutal question. Everything becomes important and more important, and who decides which is which? Take corruption. Ukraine has been eaten alive by it since independence, and even before. Imagine the wildest version of the chaotic 90s, arriving later, weaker, and never really ending. Here is the twist almost nobody outside the region knows. Before he was president, Zelensky played a president. On TV, he was an ordinary teacher who accidentally took power and smashed a corrupt system. Audiences adored that character, so when Zelensky said he would do it for real, under his own name, people voted for the new guy. The protest vote against the old parties. And at first, He delivered. He launched an anti-corruption system nobody before him had finished. People once considered untouchable were actually convicted. For a guy from television, it was a stunning start. But here's where it turns. War, old showbiz friends, and the temptation to control independent agencies meant that same system started circling his own inner court. The biggest protests since the invasion erupted when his government tried to put the Anti-Corruption Bureau under the Prosecutor General. It broke his own promise of full independence and an EU condition. Public pressure forced a retreat, but the trust cracked. Then comes the war economy itself. Take Energoatom, the company running every nuclear plant in Ukraine, where insiders describe routine bribes of 10 to 15% of contract value. Meanwhile, war freezes politics in place. Pro-Russian parties vanished, which sounds good, but there is also no normal way to change leaders. Reforms people desperately want get pushed to calmer days that never arrive. Nothing enrages people more than mobilization. It feels unfair. Critics describe street roundups, beatings, even conscription of disabled people, with thousands of complaints a year to human rights groups, and the official numbers are staggering. Since 2022, prosecutors opened over 11,000 cases for draft dodging. More than 500,000 people are wanted for avoiding service. New 2024 rules lowered the draft age from 27 to 25 and toughened penalties. The promised fixes, contract service, smarter app-based call-ups, higher pay, are mostly scheduled for 2028. One thing did work. The power of local oligarchs has crashed. War wrecked their factories, and an anti-oligarch law stripped immunities and put figures like Kolomoisky under indictment. Weaker? Yes. Gone? No. So what do Ukrainians actually want? Around 60% still trust Zelensky, yet by late 2025 and early 2026, more than half say they do not want him to run again. One thing is certain. They do not want anyone pro-Russian. Among Russian-speaking citizens, 62% now call Russia the enemy. The dream of brotherhood died on the battlefield. The most popular alternative? Valery Zaluzhny, the former top commander, now ambassador in London. Adored by the military, but known as stubborn and clashing with the president who sent him abroad. Now picture daily life. Full cafes, busy malls, children laughing on playgrounds. You would not expect that in a war, but it is real. And it does not mean the war spares them. It means people are grabbing scraps of normal while knowing a drone that slipped through could land right here. They work, walk kids to school, plan renovations because they need something to come back to. Now look at the cold numbers. The economy grows just 1 to 2%, with a likely dip predicted for 2026, but public finances are on emergency life support. In 2026, 60% of all state spending goes to defense. Ukraine simply does not have that money. It survives on an international drip feed of foreign support, and the paychecks are brutal. By early 2026, the average wage was around 30,000 hryvnia, roughly a tenth of Western Europe. The average leans on barely 11 million registered workers, with millions more in the gray economy. Now the part that keeps demographers awake. Ukraine's population fell from 42 million to around 35, and only about 31 million on government-held land. Counting refugees, dead, and abducted, that is nearly a quarter of society gone in 4 years. The war crushed life expectancy to levels seen in the world's poorest nations. For men, from 67 before the war to just 57 today. Even if it ended now, recovery would take at least a decade. Births collapsed too, around 0.9 children per woman. By late 2024, about 5.2 million refugees lived abroad, most in the EU. The government says they will return. Honest forecasts suggest only 30 to 50% might, and education is one of the most shattered structures in the country. Only about a third of students learn in a real classroom. Over 300,000 children may have no real access to school at all. Now the bill. Rebuilding Ukraine is estimated at nearly $580 billion. That is over half of Poland's entire economy. Enough to build around 50,000 kilometers of highway. And before rebuilding, there is clearing. Demining covers roughly 132,000 square kilometers, over 40% of Poland's size, including 67% of farmland. Land you cannot farm. because you could die. This is the biggest infrastructure project in Europe since World War II. So where does the money come from? Mostly loans, and loans must be repaid, or repaid in kind. The most controversial deal is the raw materials agreement with the United States. Reports describe a joint fund where Ukraine pays in half its budget revenue from new resource projects, with Washington controlling it and holding first buy rights. Early drafts were brutal. One version counted all American military aid since 2022 as a U.S. contribution, meaning Ukraine would repay every shell and rocket before seeing a cent of its own wealth. That clause was dropped, but it revealed the thinking in Washington. And here is the sting. The deal carries no security guarantees, just support for Ukraine's efforts to seek them, which really means we are not going to shoot for you. Ukraine pays in resources, whether the war ends or not. No ending looks good. Even the most optimistic scenario, freezing the front line where it is, leaves millions of Ukrainians under Russian occupation. Nobody could honestly call that a victory, and peace will not heal the deepest wound. Those who built new lives abroad and those who stayed are becoming two different peoples with different memories, different anger, a nation full of lost health, lost homes, and trauma that will weigh on it for years. Which brings us back to that medal and to Poland. As one historian put it, Polish and Ukrainian interests are simply in conflict. Whoever rules in Kiev, sooner or later we will compete. Two nations, similar size, both leaning on farming, both wanting to be the West's factory. If Ukraine rises and joins the EU, investment chasing cheaper labor will flow east. Yet we need each other against Russia, scarred by the same enemies. And that is exactly why a medal, a massacre, and a name can still cut so deep. Take care and think before you judge.